I'm Ryan Stevens.
Dr. Taylor Waters.
I'm Ben Oliver.
Welcome to the Superhuman Show, yeah?
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Superhuman Show. I'm your host, Ben Oliver, joined with Ryan Stevens and Dr. Taylor Waters. Looking shredded, ready for the photo shoot.
Looking fucking tired as well.
In what, three days? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday?
Shredded and tired.
Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday,
About three and a half days out now.
Yeah.
I've been tired for 7 weeks.
Yeah. I've been tired for 7 years.
I've been tired ever since I had kids.
Before it was tired and fat, now it's tired and lean.
Exactly.
Either way, I'm tired.
Choose your tired. Isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, so I guess it can tie into this because last week we spoke about an update on all of our preps for the photo shoot and the different methods that we were using, because we all kind of do it a slightly different way. We had different start points, different environments, training preferences, all of those things. So today we wanted to talk about it in a more general view and go through essentially methods that people will use to restrict. And so when we say methods of restriction, we're talking about essentially calorie restriction or creating an energy deficit.
Yeah.
And it's whether you're counting or not, because we're going to talk about that as a method. But essentially, no one has been able to debunk it yet that calories in, calories out is king when it comes to change in weight. And so we'll say weight as opposed to body fat, because there is nuance with protein intake being the kind of I don't know what you call it. I guess like the defining factor between the ratio of body fat to muscle that you'll lose within that weight. Because you see it all the time when people do Weight Watchers, where protein, I don't know if they've changed it now, but previously they really didn't emphasize protein. It was just overall calorie restriction. And you end up losing a shitload of weight. Everyone loves to crap on Weight Watchers, and I think it's probably had more success than any other weight loss program in the world. However, because they don't emphasize protein or resistance training, a lot of people, they lose a load of weight, but they just look like a smaller version of what they look like when they were bigger.
Yeah.
There's that lean mass drop off.
If anything, not to say they look worse, but like their body composition or ratio of like muscle or lean mass to body fat may even be worse because they've just kind of wasted away in terms of muscle.
You just shrink.
Yeah.
And you don't just want to lose weight, do you? You want to change your shape in the process.
Yeah.
And that's where like protein and resistance training comes in as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Taylor, let's just go through the kind of the different methods that we'll talk about today, and then we'll kind of break them down one by one.
Well, I guess the three key ones we're looking at here are like the numbers restriction. So the standard diets that would fall into that are calorie counting, if it fits your macros, flexible dieting, whichever route you want to go in with that. So that's where you're going to restrict numbers in order to get the desired result. Then you have food restriction. So I guess what would go into that is carnivore, keto, those types of diets where you remove certain food groups in order to get the desired result. And then you have time restriction then, which is where intermittent fasting would come into play. Okay. So you've got, in order to achieve fat loss, you need to restrict something. So what path are you going to restrict? Is it going to be the time? Is it going to be the numbers, or is it going to be the actual foods? Those are the three, I guess, headings.
Or a combination.
Or a combination, yeah.
Physical restriction, handcuff yourself.
Yeah. What, a muzzle?
Just sellotape that thing shut.
Okay. Well, this is my new diet. Walking around with a mask on.
Well, there was. I swear I read a story. There was a woman in the US, of course it's the US.
Yeah.
And the heifers. And we're looking at you. Yeah. But there was a woman, and she had her mouth wired shut because she wouldn't stop eating. But then she basically just started blending her meals and just like blending up like Mackies and chugging them.
Insane, isn't it?
And it's like,
that's not even nice. I don't even get it.
But what's great is like, well, you've obviously got motivation and drive, so we just need to channel that in the right thing.
Wait, I've had a conversation with someone who'd had a gastric band, so their stomach fast and smaller, and they lost X amount of weight. They're still heavy, and I was like, okay, so what are you doing now? And they're like, well, I figured that if I have melted chocolate, it passes easier, so I can just eat more of it. And I was like, hold on, you are trying to lose weight, yeah? They're like, yeah, what the fuck? Like, you're explaining to me how you found a hack in the system
You've managed
to get more
cheat
in. And
your
I'm like,
gastric
what?
band,
Yeah, crazy.
But
crazy.
it does happen. So let's go through, let's talk about the number restriction, pros and cons of that. So we're essentially looking at tracking food to some extent. It may not be, tracking macros. You might be following a meal plan, but you're not really restricting any specific macronutrient. It's like portion control. So you're just reducing the overall amount of food that you're consuming.
I guess a meal plan would fall into almost food restriction because you're just limiting yourself to X amount of food.
Yeah. No,
So I guess the numbers restriction would be focusing specifically on numbers, so calories, macros.
Yeah, because the pros of like tracking your food, you get more flexibility around food choice, don't you?
Well, that's the main pro. I think the biggest downside, if you can call it a downside, I don't like to view it as like pros and cons because it's just perspective.
Yeah.
One thing to consider when you're doing like the number restriction is you have to learn the skill of tracking.
Yeah. It probably takes the greatest amount of skill, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And also some people see it as an inconvenience to like weigh your food, put it into MyFitnessPal. So some people see that as an issue.
That tends to be the biggest objection, despite the tools that we have available, like MyFitnessPal, Chronometer. Like there's a bunch of different tracking apps that you can use. And it used to be you had just a big book and you had to find the food and hope it was in there, and then you'd write it down and kind of do all the maths in your head, and then you ended up following a meal plan because you're like, I'm not doing this every day with different foods.
Yeah.
That can be perceived as like a con though, but then like on the flip side of that, you've got reassurance that you can eat whatever food you want. And like this, by me tracking in MyFitnessPal, I know for sure that I can eat this food and still progress to where I want to go.
I guess the way you want to think of it is to which individual is it the least restrictive? So some people find playing the numbers game really restrictive because they're so focused on getting those numbers in check that they see that as a very heavy restriction and they push back against it. Whereas like food groups, they're like, oh, well, I can cut carbs out. I don't even care about carbs that much. Yeah. So I don't see that as very restrictive. So doing that one provides the least resistance compared to the other one. So there's, I guess, some people, I guess that's one of the cons, or whichever you want to put it, is some people perceive that number restriction as quite significant, and it then turns them off from the diet and it decreases their enjoyment.
I think so like, your food focus can go up, or just like kind of obsessing over the numbers. It's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You end up being like Rain Man with macros, where food then you just kind of looking at numbers with everything. But it's funny because I can't remember who I saw it on. Someone I follow on Instagram, but they were basically saying he's laughing that coaches still think that this is a numbers game, and he said like you're not considering certain enzymes and hormones and all of these things which impact like calories in, calories out. And I'm like, yeah, they absolutely do. And then you still get the number at the end. It's like, we're not saying that none of that stuff plays a role. Yeah. It's like all of that stuff plays a role, in terms of the calorie requirements that you need. Yeah. But it like that's because obviously you get two people the same height, same weight, same activity levels and everything, but their calorie requirements are completely different, just like us three. Yeah. We're not too dissimilar. No. Whereas Ryan's calorie intake is way higher than ours. Yeah. And it always has been. But
Ryan's the lightest of us. Yeah. So height wise, we're all relatively similar. Weight wise, Ryan's the lightest. I'm middle. You're the heaviest. Yet he requires the most food to fuel his needs, and then it sort of.
I had a client who said this to me the other day. He's like, with like they were just first starting with us, and he was like, oh, tracking my food. It's like, I can't have this, I can't have that. And it's like a perspective where you can say, well, you can view tracking your numbers, like your macros, as everything I can't have, or everything I can have and still make progress. Yeah. So it's kind of like your perspective.
And it's from which side you come from, because we mentioned this before, where like if you've gone from a real strict meal plan to then flexible dieting or like doing macros, it's easy. Like it's almost, it's way less restrictive. But if you've gone from never doing anything before to now you have this calorie ceiling that you have to kind of work within, or specific macros or whatever, it feels really restrictive. And you're like, I've only got 5 grams of fat left for the day. Now I can only have chicken or egg whites, and I can't have this. And there's, because it's a bit of a learning curve. Like we talk about it, and we do it with our clients, where, you know, you start with just becoming aware of the numbers and how many calories you're
That's
actually
one thing
consuming.
it does do very well. It raises awareness of what's being consumed and what foods you can and cannot potentially get away with and so on.
And then, you know, then maybe we'll look at tracking protein intake and calories, because then that's going to be the deciding factor between retaining or building muscle. And then we may go to specific macros, because I think it is a really good skill, because if you're aiming for 3 targets as opposed to 2, or like a protein minimum and a calorie target, you have to be more diligent with your tracking. You have to have better planning skills. You're probably going to eat more similar foods every day, because you're going to find what works and kind of just stick with it. And so all of those things typically lead to better results, because you're just being more accurate with the number. And then once you've kind of gone over that kind of peak, you then revert back to protein and calories, and you kind of auto-regulate your carbs and fats based on what you feel like you need, but you have the skill set of being very precise with your tracking at this point.
Also, as well, when you, like you said, the first step is becoming aware of like your eating habits, right? And let's say they were eating foods that, I know, donuts, cakes, or whatever. It's like, okay, now I'm really hungry. It's like, okay, well, maybe we want to fill our calories with foods which are more satiating. So you naturally use different methods of restriction as you go through the process.
Yeah.
Because like, well, I'm hitting my calories, but I was like, okay, yeah, but you had alcohol here, you had donuts here, cakes here. I'm really hungry. Okay, well, what foods are more satiating? And then you naturally use like more, like what you do, taste a lot of protein and fiber.
So it is, but I like it then, because it's like you're not restricting yourself to those foods. You're choosing to eat those foods for a certain goal. And so that perspective shift is huge, where it's like, no, I'm not restricted. Like I've got 2,500 calories today. I could eat egg whites all day and then pound a cheesecake if I wanted to.
Yeah.
I'm not restricted, but I'm just going to choose to not do that, because I know I'm probably going to be a bit hungry and not feel very good.
And that just comes down to the individual's perception of restriction. It's like, what do they perceive to be more restricting? Is it because then it's like, you know, someone from a fasting standpoint, they're like, mate, I didn't even like breakfast in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't see this as a restriction at all. Actually, I eat what I want, and I eat when I want, and I happen to lose weight. So it's all about the individual's perception of the restriction itself. Whereas, like, again, guys like, well, I guess us three are all on a similar wavelength, whereas like tracking it allows me to eat sort of what I want within reason. I can add in little bits here and there. I can be flexible with my intake because of the skills that we have. So I don't see it as, I see that as the least restrictive way. It means I can go out for a meal and I can order off a menu, and it means I can, you know, grab food while on the move. So for us, that's the least restrictive pathway in general compared to the other two. But then for other people, they might prefer a different pathway.
Yeah.
I think it's important for the client to actually experience it as well, so they can change their perspective on how they perceive that restriction. So like, let's say if someone's hungry and like they were going to pound egg whites and then a cheesecake in the night, they'd be like, oh, well, I would like that cheesecake, but I prefer to have protein and fiber because the restriction of being hungry is far worse.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think we tend to lean more towards that style long term, and that's not that we're opposed, because we do utilize all three, depending on the client. And this is where it's like, it's not one size fits all. You know, we never say like, oh, we're a macro based coaching thing, or like we've done a very good job of not biasing ourselves to any particular style of diet. The only thing we bias ourselves towards is results.
It's what works.
And so it's like, you know, you might have a client that's on paper, it looks like they're doing a keto diet, and it's like, well, we tried the tracking and he's too busy, or he just doesn't want to do it. We've tried just following a meal plan, traveling, inconvenient, you know, so we've just said, you know, let's cut the carbs out and limit, you know, starches and focus on meats and veggies. And it's kind of a carnivore-y, keto-y diet, high protein, high fiber, and he loses weight. And so it's, is it ideal? yeah, it's ideal for this current situation for this current client because that's what they can feasibly do. And so it's like when people go like, is that optimal? It's like, well, what are you comparing it to?
Yeah.
Like an elite athlete that can. It's like then no one's plan's optimal because we don't live like that.
Yeah.
But it's optimal for the current time and the current situation for the current client.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then the next one is like we've just mentioned, like restricting food groups. The most common one is carbs. Because they've been demonized for a few, like on and off for a few years. That fat was demonized for a while, and everyone went super low fat.
Yeah.
And then it's carbs tends to be the main one.
And if you're over 70, you normally restrict proteins.
Yeah, yeah, because your teeth fall out when you try.
My nan literally just eats like biscuits and toast.
But I was just about to say, like, no one is really actively restricting protein. Like, they might be eating a low protein diet by I say actively. You know, they're not trying to avoid it. They just happen to not be eating it. Yeah. So I think like I do think there's a benefit to it just in the simplicity.
Yes. Yeah.
Because
that's definitely one of the pros, isn't it?
If you, I think the issue is because if I have clients that travel and they're not going to track their food, I will say to them, just skip the carbs. Yeah. Because it's when you're traveling, typically all your protein sources are going to be higher in fat because they taste better.
Yeah.
So restaurants are going to serve fattier cuts of meat, chicken thigh. They're going to cook things in oil. It's almost unavoidable. But you cannot eat the bread. Like that's very easy to avoid. Whereas if you're going to try and go super low fat in a restaurant, good luck. Like because everything has got it in.
Dressings and oils.
Yeah.
So
it's way easier to get a steak and some veggies than try and, you know, you're eating a bit of bread, but then it's like, well, now my chicken breast is covered in oil, the veggies are covered in the oil dressing. You can't avoid the fat.
Yeah.
So I use that a lot with clients when they travel. But I think the main downside I've seen is obviously you get the initial weight loss from water if you restrict carbohydrates because you just deplete glycogen and stuff. But then you essentially, if you're not tracking the numbers, your body's very smart and will just like eventually you'll just eat more protein and fat. Like you will make up the deficit that you created by removing carbs. And now that part of your plate that was rice or pasta is now more bacon and, you know, more like peanut butter or cheese or something.
It's very easy to catch up on calories.
Yeah, which not only, it's, you know, it's double the calories of the starch and you've loaded your plate and now you're gaining weight, you know, on a no carb diet. And you're like, it doesn't make sense.
See, I think the weakness with the other two methods, so you've got obviously the number restriction, which is what we just spoke about, and then you've got the time and then the food group restriction. The weaknesses with those both is they achieve fat loss as a byproduct almost, whereas the number restriction addresses the problem at the source. Like fat loss is a numbers game to an extent. So it's like you're addressing the problem right there and then. Whereas with the food restriction and the time restriction, you're creating a restriction and hoping as a byproduct of that restriction, you are going to address the numbers. Yeah. So it's that you either address the numbers directly or you indirectly address the numbers with the other methods. And obviously it's not as bulletproof an approach because there's a fair bit more room for error. I think that's likely one of the, that's definitely one of the main problems with it. Yeah.
We won't go too deep into like, because we did an episode on like, you know, we spoke about carnivore and keto and stuff. But I think if you're really not willing to track, you know, or play the numbers game, then I think it's a viable method to an extent, but then you're going to hit that point where it stops working. And then it may not be that you start tracking the numbers, but you are going to be reducing the numbers because then you're going to have to go from, you know, ribeyes to flank steaks and, you know, using less oil to cook with and cutting back on your nuts and peanut butter and stuff like that. So you are, again, like you said, you are reducing the numbers. Just in your head, you're just not playing that game.
Yes.
But then that's the thing that you see with a lot of guys that do that type of diet where they'll say like, I cut out like fattier cuts of meat and I lost weight. And it's like, because you reduced the calories.
Yes.
But they were like, oh no, it's those foods that are bad.
No, it was just a byproduct.
That's the main difference that I see a lot of people who use these approaches is that they're unaware of fundamentally why those changes lost weight. They actually think it's the specific food. And I think if you're aware that, I just create an energy deficit by cutting out fattier cuts of meat or whatever it may be, then if you're aware of that, then you can make changes when you stall. It's like, okay, well, I've stopped losing weight, so now I'm not going to have bacon. I'm going to have chicken breast instead or something. You know. But if you think it's purely the food itself, then it's going to get to a certain point, and then it's going to stall.
And I always look at it as well. Like, I think like the number one word which we always kind of use is like practical, like the practicality of this stuff. Like, you see guys like Paul Saladino, like Carnivore MD, where like if you've seen the way he lives, you know, it's like he doesn't use soap. You know, it's like he washes his hands with like baking soda, showers with water.
You can be as shredded as you want. If you stink, you're done.
You smell like arse. But and like just the way he like it's so extreme. And if he wants to do it, more power to him. Like, cool. But for the majority of people, whether it's from a financial standpoint, like a responsibility standpoint, like I don't think he has kids or a spouse or anything. So it's like, you know, you can live like however you want.
Start using soap. You might end up having kids as well.
You might get a date. But it's again, like, because his approach is always like, look how shit broccoli is for you. Like, look how bad these chemicals are you for. Like, don't wear Lululemon with any pants because the material is going to go up your fucking ass crack and you're going to get poison on it. And it's like if you've been to any, like, have you just looked behind the back of a car and look at all the smog coming out of it that you're breathing in, like since you were born. You know, I don't think my Lycra is going to be the death of me. Like, and if it is, then it'll be a funny death. But it's just so extreme, but it demonizes things. And that I think that's the trap that you can fall into with food restriction, is you demonize the thing that you're restricting. I can't eat carbs, they're bad. I can't eat these foods, they're bad. I can't eat processed foods, they're bad. Which that is ridiculous. It's like, you can have whey protein, but you can't eat processed foods. It's like, okay, you have that pink powder that's been heavily processed.
Banoffee flavor powder.
Yeah. Just complete artificial flavorings and everything. But as and when it suits. So that's why I'm not the biggest fan. So I don't mind it as a short-term tactic of calorie restriction when tracking the numbers isn't feasible.
Because it's simple. It's very easy to implement. It's like, well, if I have 3 meals a day and I have carbs in each one, if I half the carbs in each meal, or I take carbs out of 2 meals, I'm likely going to be in a deficit more so than if I've had all carbs. So it's real simple, isn't it?
And obviously, because you know as well that you're creating an energy deficit, it's not that food is bad that you're cutting out.
Yes,
you know, and that's the main thing.
Yeah, you want people to understand why that restriction works, not get confused by thinking it was the food itself. It was just the restriction of the numbers, which happened as a byproduct of restricting the food.
And then similarly, like the time restriction, it tends to fall into that trap as well, as people think that it's the time restriction that's causing the fat loss. Like, you know, you burn way more fat when you're fasting, or like all of these cool things happen within your cells whilst you fast, and it's not the fact that you're simply eating less because you've restricted your eating window. But again, and I only really thought about this like over the last few months, because I did fasting when I was at university. I'd have like 2 shakes during the day and then a big meal in the evening. Like, I wasn't tracking calories. It was like that evening meal was whatever I wanted.
That's just because you were broke. Couldn't afford to eat 3 meals. So I used to eat 1.
But like it used to be like I would go to, because I loved it as well, because I didn't have to meal prep to go to my lectures. I would have 2 shakers in my bag, 30 seconds to make. The only thing that I found is I would get really cold during the day because I wasn't getting any, I guess, like, you know, like you eat a meal, you kind of warm a little bit. I wasn't getting that at all. I was always cold. And then in the evening, like my evening meal might be a steak, 4 donuts, and a liter of chocolate milk. Like, there was no calorie.
Soon warm up.
Yeah. Sweating all night.
Ben sweating.
But like, so I used it and it worked. And at the time, I thought it was like, oh, it's because it's fasting. And it's not fasting anyway, because I was having protein through the day. Because then people termed it like protein sparing modified fast. And it's like, that it's not fasting.
No, you're a fat student. You can't afford a meal.
And then even when people use like BCAAs when they fast, like, it's not fasting then. There's calories in BCAAs. Like, so, but anyway, I think the issue with it is you restrict your eating window. And if you're not tracking the numbers, eventually you just get very good at eating high amounts of food in one sitting. And then when you eventually revert back to not fasting, you can now pound down food in each sitting. And so you've gone from having like a huge meal in the evening to then your huge meal is now at breakfast. A couple hours later, you're hungry. You do it again at lunch and again at dinner, and you're just ravenous all day. And you've essentially trained yourself to be like a competitive eater.
Yeah.
Because you can just get a shitload of food in one sitting. And so I think like long term, I don't think it's the best approach when the feeding window is too small. Whereas like again, like you call it fasting, and because I have clients all the time where their first meal might be 11 a.m. or noon, and it's not fasting, it's pushing your calories to later in the day so you don't overeat because you're always going out for dinners and you don't really care for breakfast.
Yeah, sometimes it's just called eating when you're hungry.
Yeah.
And they're not hungry at 7 a.m., so they wait till 11. It's like there's, whether it's formally fasting with dedicated eating times, or it's just eating when we're eating at a time which suits you best. It's so. But I think let's go for the more formal fasting method where you have a restricted eating window. And again, it works great for people who are very busy and who like a bigger meal over smaller meals and don't prep very well, and like a heavier meal with their family in the evening, say, for example. So for those people, it suits better. But then again, you flip that round, and there's some people who, when they fast for certain periods, their energy levels drop off. They feel very hungry, and that takes their focus. They end up binging, and they end up going over their numbers. So again, they're hoping that the restriction of time results as a deficit as a byproduct, but then sometimes it actually results in a surplus as a byproduct. So again, you're playing it's almost like if you're going to invest in stocks, the number crunching is like the reliable, like that's the old trusty. I can see exactly the trends there, whereas the other two, they're a little bit more erratic. They're a bit more higher risk, which can actually go the other way.
That's your Bitcoin, isn't
it?
Yeah.
So
100%.
So it's, but then to sort of move on from those, we all like, okay, let's speak for me personally. I use elements of all of them.
Yeah.
Because again, the best diet is the one that you can adhere to the best. So it's like, rather than pigeonhole yourself into just one of these pathways, look at, okay, well, are there elements of each pathway that I can take which suit me at this time in my life, which is going to allow me to adhere to the overall dietary concepts themselves. So for this fat loss phase, I've tracked my nutrition. So everything gets weighed out to the gram, and I lean very much towards the number restriction. That's what that's a game that I've played. However, from a food restriction, I actually, for the vast majority of this fat loss phase, have restricted my carbohydrates to only fiber dense carbs. I have brought in the odd bit of bread and the odd bit of potato really sparingly. But outside of that, I don't buy any of that. That's normally been that's been accumulated on my travels rather than my day to day. So there has been an element of food restriction. Also, I don't add additional fats to my diet. I only accumulate trace fats. So there is an element of food restriction throughout this diet phase. And from a time restrictive phase, normally I do somewhat fast. Like in my general day to day, I won't have breakfast till a little bit later on in like the day. So maybe like 11 a.m., 12. So I don't eat between, say, 9 p.m. and 11 a.m., say, for example. That's my general. But through this phase, I've actually removed that element because I found that my energy levels and my training performance was quite poor because I was quite restricted anyway. So then going long periods of time, I was flagging a fair whack. So looking at those pathways now, I've actually removed one of the pathways that I quite often have in. I've utilized this pathway more than ever. And then this pathway, I've sort of used elements of it. So you can select bits from different pathways to build your diet, not a diet, it's your diet. And unfortunately, I can't sell mine for multi-millions or because I don't have long hair, a massive beard, and a jacked as fuck. But it's so, and this is what people need to start getting their heads around is you don't have to just lump yourself into one pathway. You can actually utilize different pathways at different times. Just like you said, when someone travels, they don't have the skills to track when they travel yet. So that pathway now has become somewhat void. So then they linked into the food restriction pathway, short term, because that was the best pathway for them at this time.
Yeah. And then also, even time restriction when they travel as well. I'd say you can have a shake during the day and then save your calories for the evening, because that's when you're going to be the most social.
Yeah.
So there's, I think that the main difference when we use them is like, yes, technically they are forms of restriction, but you don't view them as that. It's like, I don't think at any point you've said I'm restricting myself from eating bread, rice, potatoes. Like if I want them, I'll have them.
Yeah.
But I'm just choosing to eat these foods. And like, because you typically have 2 meals a day.
Yeah.
You don't go, I can only have 2 meals a day. You know, I like having 2 meals a day, so that's what I'm going to do. But if I want to change it, then I'll change it.
Yes.
And it's
The mindset there's very different, isn't it? It's very different between I can only eat 2 meals a day, so I'm choosing to eat 2 meals a day. And again, I can have bread whenever I want. But there's nothing about bread and potatoes that is bad. If anything, they're bloody marvelous. But I'm choosing to, because that's what's allowing me to adhere best at this time.
I see it the complete opposite to a restriction. In my head, I think 2 meals a day. I think, okay, bigger meals, more satiated. I still get towards my goals.
Yeah.
Whereas if someone said 6 meals a day, it wouldn't serve me very well, because that means smaller meals. I know that doesn't work for me very well. I'm going to be hungrier.
And I mean, it goes into the overall concept of like following a diet plan. Is like, you can view that in and of itself as restrictive, or you can view it as this amazing thing that we have the privilege of being able to do to change how we look just by tweaking what we consume. Like, and if there's times where you are, your calories are lower than where you would like them to be, you're choosing to do it. And so I always found dieting way easier now as I've gotten older, because you're aware that it's a choice. Like every day is a choice. I can go off my plan whenever I want because I'm an adult. It's just that I would just have to accept the consequences of that. So I don't wake up every day being like, I can't go out to eat. I can't. It's like, you can do whatever you want, but you've said that you want to achieve this thing. You know the things that you need to do to get there. And it's just a simple case of, are you willing to do those things? And there's no good or bad about it. If I decide one day I don't want to follow my diet, okay, as long as you're good with the outcome of that, crack on. And so it's because we try and we always kind of like communicate this with our clients. It's like, it's your choice to follow your plan. We're going to give you the most effective and efficient plan that we can think of that's going to help you, based on your goals, environment, all of those things. Whether you choose to do it or not is entirely up to you. And we'll never, it's different when you're dealing with competitors, but if someone's like, I just didn't feel like following my plan today, we're going to say, okay, let's have a conversation about that. Because obviously when we first spoke, you had these goals that you wanted to achieve, and we're both aware that by you not doing your plan, you're not going to get to those goals. So what's changed? But everyone has those fleeting moments, and you don't want to beat yourself up over it just because you don't want to do it at a certain point. But I think just having that perspective is like, you can stop your diet whenever you want. You can start your diet whenever you want. You can go off plan whenever you want. You can get back on plan whenever you want. You could literally take a bite off plan and then stop and then go back on plan. Or it could be a meal, or it could be a day, or it could be a week. You can just go back on plan. But I think it's, you put it on a pedestal of like, I have to, I can't have these things. I can never do these things. Like I have to do this. And I really hate that mindset, because I think it turns into that kind of punishment and restrictive cycle where it's like, well, because I failed last week, now I have to do it even harder this week. And it's like, you couldn't do it last week. What makes you think doing it harder this week is going to be successful? So we need to look at what happened, and even if anything, make it easier for ourselves rather than being even more restrictive.
People set like harsher demands on themselves when they fall short of the expectation they've just set for themselves. You give a great example. It's like, you couldn't stick to your calories last week, so now you want to drop them even more.
The amount of times clients will do that, where they'll be like, I messed up at the weekend, but let's really hit it hard this week. It's like, well, what do you think is going to happen next weekend when we go even harder this week, based on the evidence that every weekend you've gone off your plan?
It's the easiest thing to stick to is the least restrictive thing.
So
it's like there's the response to not being successful should never be greater restriction. So again, sometimes it's like, well, look, we can't even track all our food. So let's go for even less restriction of let's not have a donut this week.
Yeah.
Again, that's an easier restriction for some people. Again, everyone perceives restrictions in different ways.
It's literally like if you were doing the high jump and you missed a jump, and you go, put it up 20 centimeters. I'm gonna push a bit harder this time. And it's like, well, we should probably lower it and look at your form.
Yeah.
And then when you can do that one, then we'll go back up.
Yeah.
But then it's like, and then they go higher, and then they undershoot, and they're like, just put it up again. We'll go even harder. It's like you're not going to jump higher. And so it's like let's bring it down and see where we actually are right now, and then we can start to look at building it up.
It gets so high. It's like, right, I'm just going to drink water for 5 days.
Yeah. It's like I'm going to attach some springs to my shoes. And it gets, but like you don't look at it like that. But that's literally what people do when they try and restrict their calories further. It's like, oh, I'm just if I try harder, then it will work. But it's like, well, it won't.
For like a good general concept to think about is obviously diets pay off while you do them. Once you stop doing them, they stop paying you. You get paid by the hour.
Yeah.
So it's when you're looking at long-term success, long-term changes, you want to look at what's the path of the least resistance. So what's the least restrictive way for me to do it? Because the less restriction there is there, the easier it will be to hold long term. And again, at different times, the restriction might appear different. So like for me to go, just like you said, for me to never have carbs would be a disaster. But for me to just skip carbs for a couple of meals while I travel, that's way less of a restriction than me trying to monitor everything to the T while I travel.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's just about selecting the pathway that provides you with the least restriction. And for different people at different times, that's going to be a different thing because they're just going to perceive the restriction as slightly different. So it's important to have an understanding of all three restrictions and then being able to utilize them as and when they're needed.
The path of least resistance, but to get the outcome that you want.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Love it. So summary: choose the path of least resistance.
Yeah. Yeah.
and be flexible with your with your approach. I think that's the best one to learn. Is like, do not attach yourself to one type of diet or method because it may work now. It's probably not going to work forever. And so if you dig yourself into this hole of like, oh, this is my thing, when it stops working, you then have an identity crisis because that thing no longer serves you and you need to part ways with it. So just don't attach yourself to it in the first place. I think just be very flexible, be analytical, be logical, look at, is it working? Am I getting the result that I want? If the answer is no, change the approach. Simple. Well, thank you for listening, guys. As always, be sure to like and subscribe on Spotify and iTunes. We have our Superhuman event in 10 days.
No, less than that.
Less than that.
A week.
A week.
A week.
A week.
8 days. 7, 8 days.
Yeah.
A week tomorrow.
8 days.
A week tomorrow.
8 days Superhuman event. So if you this is probably going to come out after the event. So if any of you are listening that were at the event, we had a blast meeting you. We had an amazing time. Thanks for coming out. But thank you as always. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time.
If you love this show, please like, share, and leave us a 5-star review so that we can help more people. I'm John Madsen, Superhuman CEO, reminding you to always go get what's yours.